Thanks. Welcome again also to our participants on the webcast. We wanted to, in addition to having all the working sessions that we're going to have, feature a couple speakers to share some of the great work and big ideas going on in this community. And so at this time, we're going to have two talks. And then when we get to the Cyberlearning Summit next June, we'll have more featured speakers because the summits are really an occasion for featuring the best of what we've known, the best of what we're doing. And so our first speaker today is going to be Ryan Baker. And Ryan's the Julius and Rosa Sachs Distinguished Lecturer at Teachers College, Columbia University. He was previously at WPI and also was the Pittsburgh Science of Learning Center Data Shop Director, which has one of the largest repositories of data on learners interacting with educational software. Ryan's research combines educational data mining with observation in the field in order to understand how students respond to educational software and how these resources impact their learning. Here's Ryan.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for having me here today. It's an honor to be speaking in front of such an accomplished group of scientists and other folks, funders, community members, who are researching, building, and supporting excellent cyber learning systems with the potential to have a major impact on this country's education. So I'm going to talk to you about individualization, personalization, and folks have been talking about individualizing education for a long time. First reference I'm aware of is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but probably people were talking about it earlier. And we're finally starting to get there. There are a lot of great successful examples out there. I decided to pick three that no one in this room have built, but I could have picked dozens from this room, including cognitive tutors on the upper left, which model student knowledge in order to support student mastery learning. Weighing outposts on the top right that support student effort with online learning companions, and auto-tutor at bottom, which makes inferences about student affect in real time to drive supportive feedback. So individualization requires at least three things: determining something about the learner, knowing what matters, so determining the right things, and doing the right thing about it. I'll talk first about what we can determine about the student. There's actually been tons of progress on this in recent years, led by researchers in, among other places, the user modeling community, the Society for Learning Analytics Research, and the Educational Data Mining Society. And these researchers have been able to infer a lot of cool stuff. So among other things, complex cognitive skill in a range of educational domains. Not just whether students have learned something, but how deeply they've learned it, including work on inferring retention. How long are students going to remember what they learn? Transfer versus shallow learning. So are students going to be able to transfer what they learned to new contexts and to related situations? And preparation for future learning. We have a student learning something in a cyber learning system. Will they be prepared to learn the next thing later on? And researchers have been able to automatically detect these things. Similarly, metacognition. People have been able to detect constructs like self-efficacy, whether students engage in metacognitive behaviors like self-explaining even without being told to, help avoidance, which is not a good behavior sometimes, and things like conscientiousness and persistence. And moving from people who don't ask for help when they need it, there's also inference of disengaged behaviors. Stuff like gaming the system, where students repeatedly, for example, repeatedly guess until they can get the right answer, maybe trying 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 38. Off-task behavior, which maybe a student is, instead of learning from the cyber learning system, talking to their neighbor about one direction. Those of you who have a teenage kid probably know that one. Inexplicable behavior, sometimes called WTF behavior, stands for without thinking fastidiously. That's when a kid is plotting points in a graph, say, and they plot a smiley face. And carelessness, where students know how to come up with the appropriate answer, know how to do the task at hand, but just somehow don't do it. And affect, students' emotion and context, people have been able to detect without any physiological sensors, just from the interaction logs within cyberlearning systems, constructs like boredom, frustration, engaged concentration, that's the affective state associated with Csikszentmihalyi's flow, curiosity, excitement, situational interest, and even joy, which many of the cyberlearning systems here create, I'm given to understand. So, give a quick example. Some of our groups work on automated detectors of student engagement and affect in assessments, which is a learning system developed by Neil and Christina Heffernan, which assesses as it assists. So the process of modeling engagement and affect in the system, first step is that we conduct field observations of student engagement and affect using a field observational protocol, and that protocol is implemented on an Android app which synchronizes between the field observations and the log files of student interaction with the software. If anyone wants it, I'm happy to tell you how you can get it for free. And then we use data mining to find the behaviors that co-occur with the human observations. So we distill, in the case of assessments, 160 features of student interaction with the software, and then compare a small set of data mining algorithms that can fit different patterns within the data. And as doing so, create models that can infer the same things the human observers are inferring, but from just the information in the log files. And then we test the model generalizability on new students from diverse populations, including, in this case, students in rural, urban, and suburban schools in the northeastern U.S. We picked the northeastern U.S. because that's where most of the students using assessments are. It's used by 50,000 kids a year right now, with the majority being in Massachusetts and Maine. And the population was diverse in terms of SES, race, and ethnicity. And the result was models that can distinguish a bored, confused, frustrated, engaged, off-task, or gaming student, depending on the construct, between 63% and 82% of the time, achieving agreement with human coders about 1/3 to 2/3 as well as the coders agree with each other. So it's well below perfect, but the nice thing is it's massively scalable because you can just build it in the software and apply it to data from the entire year from every one of the 50,000 kids who's using that software all year long. So, okay, we can determine a lot of things. That's an example. But we have to know what matters. Let me give you an example of something I've worked on that probably doesn't matter as much. Off-task behavior. So there's a number of things talking about how you can detect off-task behavior. These models can infer from what happens before and after a student pauses in the software. For instance, whether the student is off-task or getting help from another student or the teacher, for instance. Off-task behavior is continually a focus of classroom management practice. It's one of the biggest things that teachers in the field pay attention to. But in fact, it's more weakly correlated with learning and other outcomes than many other constructs in engagement and affect. Replicably, across a lot of studies, gets a correlation of about -0.1. And off-task behavior can foster positive collaborative relationships if students are collaborating. A lot of the research finding negative correlations was actually conducted in situations where students couldn't talk to other students. But it turns out to be a relatively positive collaboration strategy in moderation, and it disrupts boredom, which across studies gets a correlation with learning more like -0.4. So it's also an effective emotional regulation strategy. So probably reduction of off-task behavior shouldn't be a focus of cyberlearning systems, though probably carefully leveraging and managing it may still be useful. So in focusing on what matters, we can think about what the things we can model out of the software correlate to over a longer term. For example, longer term learning outcomes. What are we seeing that correlates not just to a student doing better right away, but over the long term? Dropout, who drops out of high school? College enrollment at the bottom. I'll give an example of that in a minute. And on the left, choice of STEM or other societally useful careers is another thing we can be thinking about the long term, which relates to what people are interested over in iTest. So to give a quick example, we took those automated detectors of engagement, affect, and also detectors of learning in assessments, and we used them to predict, and the assessments is used by middle school students for math, 1 day a week typically, and we were able to use this to predict whether a student will go to college or not 6 years later. This is a nice example of the power of logs, because in about 2010 we said, hey, wouldn't it be great to do this? But what do? This is like middle school students 6 years later. Aha, we'll go back to data from 2004 to 2007 and then track forward and see what's happening now. And so for completely unseen students, this model can say whether they're likely to go to college or not from their engagement in the software 69% of the time. But even better yet, there's been a lot of work on predicting who will go to college. A lot of it comes from grades or disciplinary referrals. This model can indicate what aspects of a student's behavior are predictive of college attendance based on more subtle signals that may be a little more actionable and intervenable. Things like Alex is less likely to go to college because he's getting confused and gaming the system. Or Maria's less likely to go to college, and the top predictive factors are she's getting bored and careless. So for individual students, we have a engagement and affect profile indicating where are the places they most need some support. Okay, so we've determined something about the student, and we think it matters. What do we do about it? What do we do when we know one of these things? There's a huge space of potential intervention. Theory can be our guide for which intervention to use, but which theory? There's a lot of theory out there. And is it going to be applicable in the current situation? And knowing that detection is always going to be wrong sometimes. It's funny, people in education often expect for detector, they say, why your detector is not 100% or not 99.9, it must be no good. In fact, medicine doesn't have that standard. A lot of medical tests that are used for early diagnosis are way below that level. And so what are the relative costs of incorrectly applied interventions compared to the benefits of correctly applied interventions? We need to make that kind of cost-benefit analysis on our interventions. What we need, and I'm biased on this one, more data. Love data. For one thing, we need lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of randomized studies comparing individualized interventions. This was called for in the recent SRI report, and I think Jack Mosta over there was a relatively early person talking about the value of this. I think Jack had papers on this. Well, Jack and I first talked about this back in, I think, 2000. And I said, that's a great idea, Jack. So I'm repeating Jack's great idea from 11 years ago. We can deploy these automatically through online learning systems, much like developers of platforms like Facebook and Google and Zynga do. Try at small scale and then ramp up the successes automatically, and try, fail, and try again quickly. That's one really nice thing about online cyber learning platforms. Some systems have really started to get that vision and are now used for hundreds of studies conceived by outside experimenters, which is a powerful tool for progress. The PSLC Learn Labs are an example of that. The assessments platform I mentioned, Heffernan and Heffernan have been very supportive to my group in using that as a research platform. And I heard from Neil recently that 147 outside experiments have been conducted in assessments. So if you think that's cool, go talk to them. They might be a great place for you to do your experiments. And people in the MOOC world are talking about moving in this direction, although I haven't heard all that much concrete work at scale in those terms yet. In these studies, automated detectors like the ones I've mentioned can be used to drive interventions. But beyond that, they can also be used to understand the results of the interventions. So I have a great new confusion intervention. What are the results on future confusion, future boredom, future gaming a system, future learning of the same topic, and future learning of new topics, and so on? For these kind of tight little experiments, we can't actually necessarily look at who's going to go to college 6 years later. That takes a while. But there's a lot of things we can look at. And with these methods, we can not only create more individualized learning experiences, but understand the full range of effects of our interventions, creating a feedback loop that makes online learning more and more effective and engaging each year. So I'd like to thank you all for your attention to my talk. Hope it was interesting. If you'd like to learn more about the research I talked about, we've got a Twitter and a Facebook, a publications page, and a Big Day in Education course on Coursera, which is the scariest thing I've done in a while. Also, tell your bright undergraduates about our new Masters in Learning Analytics. Thank you. Yeah, I think we've got a couple minutes for questions.
So you mentioned the ability to predict using a lot of these factors. Maybe I missed it, but did you use the prediction of accuracy to see if it's just whether the student answers the question right or wrong, or what particular noise that they chose?
That is actually part of the model that predicts who goes to college. It's not the key factor, but it actually helps to understand a lot of the other factors. For example, carelessness means something very different in the context of a student who's getting a lot of stuff right and a student who's getting a lot of stuff wrong. Jack.
Can you say more about how you go about analyzing the trade-offs between the benefits of correct decisions and the costs of incorrectness?
That's a great question. Oh, I'm sorry. That question was, how do you go about assessing the trade-off between the costs and benefits of an intervention? I think, first of all, you have to look at what the false positive and false negative rates are. When you have an intervention that's working, when you've collected some data, you can see how it benefits the students who got interventions correctly applied, but you can also start to see what happened to the students who got them negatively applied. So I think collecting some data along those lines is a useful step. There's a whole literature on cost effectiveness and cost benefit analysis coming out of economics that I'm starting to talk to folks in. I think that will have some useful lessons for this community as well. Yeah, Jody.
So when the data tell you things that you think are very important, but there's no outside measure that already exists, what's your answer to validity?
So the question was, when the data tell you something you think is very important, but there's no outside measure that's handy, what do you do? I mean, that's a great question, and that relates to some of the work we've been collaborating on.
I want an answer.
Yeah. We've had this problem a lot when we look at scientific inquiry skill and science reasoning skill across projects, because the existing tests often are very expensive. Like, the things that really get these skills are very expensive to conduct and to look at. One thing that I think is relatively useful for that is, again, prediction of future other things that matter. Like, to some extent, if you can get something that agrees with human beings, then you know that you're capturing something human beings can capture. And if that thing itself predicts future outcomes of other things, then that gives you some evidence of substantive validity. But it is tricky when we're trying to model new constructs we couldn't model with old methods. That's true of almost everything up on those slides earlier. It's a real challenge for the field. Good question. Lewis.
So I see a risk here of drawing false conclusions if you are not measuring the right constructs or detecting the right constructs. And I think your example of off-task behavior is a good example. How to look at that, I would think as well. Probably the construct we should be looking for is rapport building activities as contributing to collaboration. Since you classified it as off-task, you don't have a good way of discriminating the rapport building stuff with other miscellaneous stuff. So how do you avoid drawing false conclusions from the wrong construct?
Well, I agree completely with what you're saying. I think we should have more detectors of on-task conversation and rapport building activities that matter. That's actually been a relatively hard nut to crack compared to some other ones from just log data. That may be something that requires other kinds of information to get at. But I agree. Oftentimes, we think we're getting X, and we are getting X, but we're getting Y and Z in there. And that's why it's important to try to get the best broad data. That's, for example, why our group, when we model off-task, doesn't just model pause, but actually has field observations that say whether the kid is genuinely off-task or engaging in classroom activities. And we can just make that kind of distinction. What is interesting is that even it's part of how you define it, because what we were thinking of as off-task does include some rapport building, and that actually turns out to be a positive thing in some cases. So I don't have a good, simple answer to that, except that I think that's something we have to be paying continual attention to. I think I'm...
Yes. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ryan. And now I'd like to introduce Kylie Peppler. Kylie is an assistant professor of learning sciences at Indiana University. She's an artist by training, and her research focuses on the intersection of arts, computational media, and informal learning. And her work is supported both by NSF and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation.
Thank you. Well, it's my pleasure to be here. And, oh, that is not my first slide. There we go. So it's my pleasure to be here, and I want to turn our discussion slightly to talking about one of our 6 focal areas, and turn our attention to informal learning communities and compelling evidence of interest-driven learning that takes place within these settings, and offer some open-ended questions that, and possibilities for both cyber learning and cyber infrastructure to fill some of the voids in our understanding in this area. As this talk suggests, I place a particular emphasis on youth interest-driven learning, a modality that, while peer-based, can connect youth across shared common interests and act as a doorway into the kinds of learning that we've traditionally really valued in school. And what I found that is an absence of direct instruction in these peer-to-peer communities is actually they're learning a lot of the things that we value in school. And so I want to show you a couple of those examples and the progress that we've been making around measuring in those situations. So a focus on informal or interest-driven learning quickly situates us in the informal learning landscape, where youth have the time and hopefully the agency to pursue and deepen their interests without the constraints of compulsory education. So today, the relevance of mass formal education and its ability to engage youth, especially coming from non-dominant communities, is growing under increasing critique. And so the investigation into informal learning models offers us a remedy to those perceived deficiencies of mass formal education and a source of alternative educational strategies. So many like myself are really excited about this area. So over the past 2 decades, there's been a couple of things that have been opening that have been kind of the center of my research. And the first and foremost is about these community technology centers that have been opening in the US, specifically to provide better access to technology in non-dominant communities. Similarly, there's been many models of informal after-school programs that have been set up as alternatives to school-based learning. And so you can see, you might be familiar with the Fifth Dimension, Boys and Girls Clubs, or the Computer Clubhouse, for example. And as we start to talk about informal learning, we can actually think about this across 2 dimensions. A lot of times we think about the vertical here. We think about the setting, the differences between a formal setting like school and an informal setting like a grassroots organization like maker fairs, or just a gathering in the streets by a lot of urban youth. But we can also think about the x-axis here and how curriculum can actually vary from it being formal and informal, from being structured that you might find in more school settings, with teaching with textbooks, for example, all the way over to pick up basketball and things that don't have any formalisms to them. And so the focus of my research is really at this intersection that you see there. So what do we know about informal learning? And one of the primary things I'm going to share with you today is that we know that interest is really important condition for learning, and it's a driving force of informal and out-of-school landscape. We know that from a variety of perspectives. We know that interest influences attention, goal setting, and levels of learning. It's a condition for those things for learning to happen. We also know that interest is context dependent. It's content dependent, so it's not just general, it's not just all biology activities. You might just actually really be excited about something in particular. It's community driven, so it's supported by your community and the resources that you have access to, and it's culturally specific. Informal learning and choice are also important aspects to interest-driven learning, and so we're actually finding more and more that a lot of these retrospective histories, for example, a lot of what we know about kind of long-term interest in STEM careers, a lot of it's happening in the informal hours, and so it becomes this important arena for us to understand what's happening there. And a lot of it is interest-driven. It's not something that comes from very structured programs, and it's unique to learners. But we also know that the kind of geeking out that we'd like to see doesn't happen as often as what we'd like. So how do we move youth along that trajectory and deepen their learning over time, especially in these unstructured communities? So what are we making good progress on? So historically, there's been a couple problems plaguing this field. And so that informal learning has been proven difficult to measure for example. It's been difficult to track over time. There's latencies. So a lot of times you'll get inspired by something and it won't show up for 2 or 3 years later. And a lot of times in these retrospective histories, you see it. These Anne Renninger's work on interest development, for example, there's these latencies that happen over time. And it's also difficult to disentangle what's the true value of the informal learning environment when we know kids are going to school too. And then also there's difficulties to demonstrate the cumulative impact, especially at levels beyond the programmatic or individual level. How do we think about informal learning's impact on educating society more broadly on the community level aspects? So my work and the work of several others are kind of making good progress in this area. I think within the cyberlearning community, you're especially seeing all of this work move out of the lab into real-world ecologies. You're seeing that people are designing learning experiences to really engage any age group in authentically meeting the learner at the interface of their interests and their readiness to learn. And we're making some good progress on measuring growth and learning at the individual group or program level and increasingly at the community levels. And I love John Falk's work for this reason, as he was looking at the LA area and the influence of museum learning on that community. So I'm going to share 3 examples from my work and how the kinds of evidence of interest-driven learning in these areas. So the first example is going to come from my work on Rock Band. So this took place at a Boys and Girls Club. Rock Band had just hit the market, and we had done some initial field observations, and the kids just generally weren't interested in the free violin or recorder lessons that they had offered there daily. So we started this Rock Band club. It quickly became the most popular thing at the Boys and Girls Club, and it was all peer-driven. The kids took their turns practicing the instruments, but they really took it very seriously, and they had no prior experience. And so for about 9 months, they consistently played Rock Band. And then we administered these traditional music assessments that look kind of like this, in sight reading, transcription, and echoing task. And we developed these in coordination with the local music teachers. And what we found, actually, was that the number of Rock Band gameplays was significantly correlated with the average score on these traditional music assessments. And so you could have 2 interpretations here. One is that students are improving in their musicality as they play Rock Band longer, or 2, that youth are better at the game are actually better musicians in the first place. But either really point to the fact that these representations actually have a lot to do with one another, and to some interesting findings. We were really heartened because what we started to find was our Rock Band players, as soon as the music club moved into our room, they signed up and took up the wait list. And so when we interviewed the kids, they actually said things like this, that, I want to play the guitar. And so if I could do this, if I could play the violin, then I could do this and play the guitar. And so what we're looking for is these doorways in. When do we start to affiliate with these activities that we value in school settings? The second example comes from the work I did around Scratch at the Computer Clubhouse. And so the Computer Clubhouse, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is actually a thriving network of over 100 computer clubhouses around the world. It began a couple decades ago in response to the genuine desire for a handful of curious teenagers for a place to design and create things with new technology. And in absence of any sort of directed structure, just having access to materials, building a community. And it's spread now, there's over 70 in the United States and several outside the US as well. And one of the things that was happening, and sort of despite all best intentions, was that there wasn't a computer programming culture at the computer clubhouses. But there was this really great Adobe Photoshop culture. And so the whole intent, as we were working on the initial Scratch designs, was to bridge this idea between the media-rich culture that they had, the stuff that they were doing in media mixing, both with sound and with images, into the computer programming land. And so that we were able to leverage youth culture in that way. And so by doing so, it actually became the top software at the early sites that we were looking at, even above the kinds of software that the kids were using for homework help and so on. And what we were left wondering, was, Scratch was a computer programming language, but what happens when it's deployed in these kinds of settings? What do kids actually learn about computer programming or the computational concepts in which it was designed? And I think what's really important to note here is that there was no explicit instruction on computer programming. Actually, we went the other way, right? It was all peer-to-peer kinds of things. We sent in adults, but they quickly became the learners because they rotated in and out every 8 weeks, and they were just, novices, undergraduate liberal arts majors. And so, you could look at Scratch, you could actually see all of the kinds of computational concepts that are difficult for undergraduate majors in engineering and computer science. So we looked at how the community developed over time. And actually, for the majority of the things that we were looking for, the concepts that are really difficult for undergraduates to tackle, we saw them significantly improve in year 2. We saw them significantly improve for all of our case studies too. But what was interesting is that our novices coming into the environment were actually being apprenticed in by their peers at more sophisticated levels than what their year 1 peers were. They were learning and sharing these innovations because it was really cool to learn how to use variables to then have a game in which you could keep track of the score, right? And so you can imagine how these computational concepts really spread like wildfire amongst the community. And the last example here comes from the work that I've been doing most recently on e-textiles. And e-textiles are part of this larger maker movement. Dale Dougherty, sort of the founder of Make Magazine and Maker Media, he says, the most important thing about DIY or do-it-yourself culture is that it portrays the idea that you can learn to do anything. And so it's really a community of people that are gathering in their spare time, learning how to do very complex things. And it's captured national attention now. Even the White House is pointing to the maker movement. I wouldn't be surprised if several of you in this room are really excited about what's happening there. Amongst other things, I've been following a sub-community of e-textiles designers because there's some really interesting things happening there. And you may have seen a couple things at the Super Bowl halftime show a couple years ago. There was a whole e-textiles display. Lady Gaga, people on the runway have been wearing e-textiles. And so those of you that aren't familiar with the e-textiles is that it's actually a blending of electronics and textiles. And so you can see here in this image, this is one of the first toolkits that actually helped to bridge the divide between what professionals were able to do and what novices can do. So this whole community is just burgeoning, really in the last 5 to 7 years. And so you can see this microcontroller that's literally being sewn into this t-shirt with conductive thread that's replacing traditional insulated wiring and soldering. And so e-textiles began to represent for us a range of opportunities and affordances for learning in physical computing and design. And I'm going to share some of the work that we did around understanding and diagramming circuits as an example of that. And so we looked at how people traditionally assessed understanding of circuits, and it's deeply rooted in the materials that we use. We also realized that these materials foster misunderstandings about circuits. And so not unsurprisingly, like in so many of our fields, our undergraduates arrive with misunderstandings of almost every aspect of circuitry. So we had to design new assessments to address that gap. And this is a pretest from one of the kids that had just gotten out of his class. It was a high-achieving kid, right? And it really felt like he understood circuitry and could talk the talk, but really couldn't apply that understanding of the older materials to these e-textile materials in our pretest result. And so you see them struggling with this idea of like current flow, circuit connections, battery connections, and so on. And this is where he ended up at the end of the post-test results. And that was similar for all of the kids that participated in our work, and they improved significantly across these range of understandings. And so this led us to really understand that a lot of times we design toolkits for learning that intentionally hide or make invisible what makes them work. And we try to make it so easy that the kid can't fail. And by contrast, we're starting to understand that visibility, those mistakes, that debugging, that's actually where the learning happens, that is unforgettable over time. And so e-textiles, we found, afforded those opportunities to learn about circuitry in ways that illuminate the key concepts. So cumulatively, these examples illustrate a few things. First, that there's a developmentally authentic way to teach nearly any topic to youth, particularly when we leverage youth culture surrounding music, media, and fashion, for example. Second, that computational media is making it possible to do so in informal settings. So for example, Rock Band can authentically teach youth about music performance before they necessarily are ready to take on the commitment of a real instrument, or alternatively to teach computer programming to youth via Scratch and so forth. So, and lastly, I think these examples really present that we're making some good progress on how to measure the growth and learning in each of these settings. So cumulatively across these examples, we could get creative about our logic of comparison that can lead to these evidence-based cases that interest-driven activities are really leading to learning in informal settings. But they're all measured relatively in the short term, which leads us to some open questions that naturally emerge from this work, particularly looking toward the long-term impacts of informal learning and interest-driven learning. And so myself and Robert Ty has pulled together a bunch of colleagues that are kind of interested in this particular issue of like what happens in the long term when we know that there's these, that interest actually develops, not in the short term, but it's the long haul. And it's difficult to disentangle, although we're starting to see some evidence here. So given this investment, how might we encourage youth to work on problems that matter in particular? This is not just any type of interest-driven learning. We want to find things that represent what Seymour Papert would call powerful ideas, or things that would resonate beyond just playing with technologies. This also points to a need to move from only comparing 2 points in time that are relatively short, close together, or these retrospective studies, to truly longitudinal studies, because the way interest develops into long-term college and career readiness is truly longitudinal. And so it's particularly interesting for us to think about following youth from the larger maker movement, for example, from these kinds of informal learning programs, from our science museums, or other online learning opportunities. And so there's a few questions that sort of emerge for us. And I think lastly, from prior studies on informal learning, like Flavio Azevedo's work, require intensive qualitative work over a long period of time, or whole NSF centers like the Life Center. So how might we identify and transform these interest-driven learning experiences using cyber-learning technology to design intervention or to gauge interest? How might we use those infrastructure tools and some community agreements about how to share that data that comes from youth interactions, behaviors, and work over the long term. So thank you, and it's been a bit of pleasure talking to all of you today, and I invite you to ask any questions at this point. Yeah, the gentleman behind you, yes.
Looked into that? Have you looked into that issue as well? Been able to study that?
Yeah, so he asked a question about this issue of transfer. And so I think that's actually one of the things that we're going to be springboarding in to look at. And so we're looking at, say, the toolkits that allow youth to learn around circuitry, and to think about how they move between these toolkits. What are the various affordances of them? We might do some analysis of them initially, but also look at how kids move between those sets to learn more about how they're transferring. Scratch has a lot of those questions open as well.
Can you just wait for the mic? I'm sorry, we need the mic for the webcast.
Are you looking at issues of, for lack of a better phrase, motivational transfer? That is to say that the confidence that learners gain in these informal settings give them better self-confidence, self-efficacy in more formal learning activities.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly what we see. One of my graduate students, that's been one of his particular interests, particularly in Rock Band, because you could see how it sounds really hard and tough to start the violin, but then building that confidence, that motivation to learn over time becomes really important.
Very cool stuff. Interest-driven learning to me meant that you learn about the thing that interests you. And what I was struck by in the assessments is that the assessment is common because it's looking at how well have you mastered the tools that everybody's learning to do their own thing.
Yeah.
Not that you're not already working on problems that are hard enough, but have you thought about how you assess learning when the learning goal that you're trying to assess progress towards is individually selected?
Yeah, so that, I mean, what we found is that we have to look somewhat at the commonalities, right? So, and Scratch is a good example, is that across all of those projects you were looking at, those are video games, those are interactive art projects, those are digital stories, and so we don't necessarily restrict the kinds of genres of work that the kids are doing with it, but we look at what happens in the development of that tool use. There's interesting stuff that happens in those choices, right? So it turns out video games actually are really good for teaching about variables, right? So there's an interaction between the genre and those kinds of outcomes. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kylie, and thank you, Ryan, for actually mutually stimulating talks, because both about how do we use more evidence in two different frames, and both with great open questions that should drive us forward now into the working groups as well. So in a minute, we're going to take a break, but before we do that, one of the things we've been doing with this meeting is taking a little bit of time to make connections, and I want to briefly introduce three people to make a couple additional connections for us. I think I see Bev in the background there. There you are, yep. Okay, so that will be John Chernovsky and Bill Penuel and Beverly Wolf. And John's going to tell us about a recent report of interest, Bill about a conference, and Bev about an exciting new position she has.
You'll see a stack of these outside. This is a workshop report from early January of this year, which we funded in order to investigate some research questions, very small workshop, on higher education and how technology is impacting it. In particular, this report rose out of the hoopla around MOOCs and other disruptive technologies. There's some very interesting insights here and framing of questions for technology and education. Again, this is restricted to higher education, but I think many of this goes to informal and also to K-12. Anyhow, they're out there, and you're free to pick them up. They're also available online at the Computing Research Association website, cra.org.
Okay. Whoops. So I want to announce a conference and give folks a little bit more as a particular, you might think of this as a concrete product that comes out of this. In Boulder at the University of Colorado, we'll be hosting the International Conference of the Learning Sciences on June 23rd to the 27th. And I want to mention that the theme covers a range of these topics. It's called Learning and Becoming in Practice, and we'll be focusing and encouraging proposals on 5 different practices that relate to the learning sciences. Learning within the epistemic practices of disciplines, learning in everyday sociocultural practices, a focus on learning through making, like Kylie just talked about, called practices of design, as well as our practices of design as a learning sciences community. Practices of analyzing and modeling learning across settings and time. And finally, and this relates to Joan's remarks earlier, practices of scaling and sustainability. Call for proposals and workshops, and also a special format for design charrettes is all up on our ICLS website. Joe Pullman will be soon sending out requests for reviewers as one of our program co-chairs. So I encourage you to review, but also think about this in your small group work as a possibility for something you might develop. And since I'm not projecting it, if you would like the URL, but simply look at ICLS 2014 and you should be able to find the website.
And last, I want to introduce Beverly Wolf, who has been a long-time leader of our field. And she has a wonderful new opportunity. We've been talking about this meeting about opportunities for impact, and I want to introduce Bev to share hers.
Thank you very much. The White House has begun an initiative where
White House Innovation Fellows are invited to the government to start working in areas where technological innovation might help. So for instance, entrepreneurs and academics who have innovated in their life have been brought to a certain number of agencies, including USAID, the Treasury, Energy, Cyber Physical, FEMA aid, and USAID, and things like that. So I have been invited as the education innovator to come and work with the National Science Foundation, the U.S. Department of Education, and actually USAID. In other words, we're trying to bring entrepreneurship and innovation that we have used in the public sphere and in the academic sphere, bring it into government and see if we can make an impact. So obviously, being part of this community, my idea has been, and actually it turned out this was NSF's idea also. So NSF for 60 years has been funding new strategies, new technologies in education. But you walk into the classroom and what do you see? It looks like when all of us went to school, right? The same textbooks almost, they're linear and they're not multimedia, and the same lectures and the same one person trying to deal with 30 people. So my mission is to work with the innovators in the federal government to try to see what we can do to bring this repository of good systems that we're hearing about through the conference, bring them into the classroom. What will it take? My view right now is that it's three communities that I have to work with. One is certainly the teachers and principals and stakeholders and students. But a second is probably the publishers and small companies who should take advantage of all this and purchase this equipment and make sure it gets deployed. And then also you guys, the research community. So I'm working with all of you, and I definitely want you all to give me ideas. I've already pinged several people. I just want new ideas. I'm in this position for 6 months to a year, and I think it's a great opportunity for all of us to say to government, you know, why haven't we tried this? What about that? Let's go with that. And can we have certain community meetings to activate, to excite the community about these subjects? Okay, and so, yeah, and I'll be on the 4th, at 4 o'clock, I'll be in one of the panels to talk about these things. So thank you, and I look forward to our interaction. Bye-bye.